I've been hosting this podcast for a little more than 3 years now. And back 3 years ago, this episode would have taken me probably 2.5 days to complete, between brainstorming ideas, coming up with the content that I wanted to talk about, the exact way that I wanted to present it, recording and re-recording because I screwed it up, and re-recording again because I screwed it up, and re-recording and then editing. It would have just taken me a long time. I spent typically 2 or 3 days on every episode. This one, probably an hour and a half. And that's not because I am using some fancy AI tools to do all the work for me. It is not because I'm using done-for-you content. It is not because I got super good at editing podcast episodes. But it is because I have a tool in my toolbox that makes creating content faster and easier. This is episode 132 of the Tiny Course Empire podcast, and today I want to share with you one of my secret weapons. It's a simple content framework that makes every piece of writing, every piece of content so much easier to create. These are my never start from scratch tools that I use to consistently publish a podcast each and every week. They're the tools that I use to consistently email my list, mostly daily. They're the tools that I use to create Substack content every week. They are the tools that I use to even create courses for Six Figure Systems members. If you struggle with consistency when it comes to content marketing, this is the one thing that I'm going to recommend you add to your own personal toolbox. So let's talk about it. Hey, real quick before we dive into today's topic, I just want to remind you that any resources I mention will be linked below in the description. And if you're new here, be sure to hit the subscribe button. New episodes drop every Monday morning. Next week, I want to talk to you about the difference between quality and quantity in your content and why you might want to focus on one over the other. And just a hint, it's probably not the one you think it is. But that's next week. This week, we're going to talk about using content frameworks to make publishing easier and faster so that you can build up that consistency muscle that is so important when we're talking about content marketing. You probably know that my online business journey started as a content creator. I was writing content. These were back in the days of blogs and article marketing, and I was writing content for other online business owners. I wrote content about every topic under the sun. I wrote about vacations in Gatlinburg and cruises, and I wrote about online marketing, and I wrote about jewelry, and I wrote about finance. Anything that anybody would hire me to do, I would write about it. So I was kind of a Jane of all trades. And one of the hardest things for me was staring at that blank page. Creating an article for someone else, even after I'd done all of the research, even after I was pretty sure I had a good handle on what I was talking about, staring at that blank page and writing something from scratch was painful. Even when I went out on my own as a course creator and a membership site owner, ramping up my email marketing was difficult because every day I had to come up with a new email. Every day I was staring at that blank page and I didn't know what to write about, and I didn't know how to format it, and I didn't know what the structure should be like. And it just made it so much harder. Then, of course, when I started the podcast, you know what happened there. I was spending 2 or 3 days every week just producing a single podcast episode. Obviously, that's not sustainable. I can't spend 2 or 3 days every week creating this podcast. I wouldn't get anything else done. So I had to come up with a better system, with a better plan for creating all of the content that needed to be created in order to grow my business. So fast forward to today, and this episode that I'm recording right now and that you're watching took me less than an hour to put together. Now, I'm not including recording and editing. Obviously, that all takes time. But in terms of writing the content, it took me less than an hour to put this together. And that's because I use a content framework. And if you've been listening to the podcast for a while, you will probably recognize my content framework. It looks like this. First, I have the introduction. This is a personal story that I tell in the beginning. This episode was about how it used to take me 2 to 3 days to write a podcast episode. So it's kind of meta, right? So first there's the introduction. Then I welcome the audience, and I do 2 different welcomes. I do one for podcast listeners and I do one for YouTube viewers. So depending on which version of the podcast you're listening to, you might hear something slightly different, but those are both baked into my content framework that I'm working with. Then I have a transition. That's where you are right now. We are in the transition between the introduction and the main part of the content. Then after the transition, we move into the main content. Then I recap what we talked about, and then I have a final call to action. So that's my entire framework. It's a very simple template. There's nothing special about it. There's nothing fancy about it, but it is enough for me to just go in and be able to fill in the blanks. It is enough so that I'm not staring at that blank screen thinking, what am I going to talk about? And how am I going to transition? And how am I going to make this clear to people? And how am I going to make this useful? I don't have to think about any of that because it's all baked right into that framework that I'm working with. And all I have to do then is go in and fill in the blanks. Now, this is episode 132 of the podcast, and it has taken me 132 episodes to really dial in this framework. And honestly, it changes. It changes all the time. I changed it up when I started doing YouTube in addition to just the audio podcast. I have changed it up to include different elements or to take other elements out. So it is always a work in process. But every week when I go to write this podcast episode, being able to open up that framework and just fill in the blanks saves me just an enormous amount of time. Like I said, I've gone from 2.5 days to record a podcast episode to a half a day or less. By the time I get it written, get it recorded, get it edited, it usually takes me 3 or 4 hours total. So just an enormous amount of time saved just by using this framework, and an enormous amount of stress and anxiety as well, because I don't have to reinvent the wheel every single week. And the same is true with my emails, and the same is true with my Substack, and the same was true with my blog when I was doing blogging. So these content frameworks can really help you improve your content marketing game. So let's talk about how you can create your own content framework or your own content template to work from. I recommend you start with 3 basic questions about any piece of content that you are going to create. The first question is, what is the key takeaway that you want your readers or your listeners or your YouTube viewers or your Facebook Live attendees, what is that key takeaway that you want them to walk away with? So this can be something like a lesson, a key piece of information that you want them to really understand and think about. Maybe it's a powerful quote that you want them to walk away with and think about later. Maybe it is a new way of thinking about the world, or thinking about their goals, or thinking about the project that they're working on. That would be a lesson. Or you might want them to walk away with some inspiration, maybe just the knowledge that they can achieve that goal that they're going after, or that they can reach that milestone that you are helping them to go for, right? So that would be inspiration. Or maybe it's how-to information. So this podcast episode today is all about how to create a content framework to work from so that you can achieve your content marketing goals. So those are kind of 3 key takeaways that you might want to think about in relation to any piece of content that you are creating. Then the next question that you want to ask yourself is, what's the story that's going to make this memorable? I recommend you always try to include some kind of a story. And this doesn't need to be, pages and pages, obviously. It can be just 1 or 2 sentences that really makes a connection for people, that helps them to remember that key takeaway, that really drives it home. And that story can be a personal story. At the beginning of this episode, I told you the personal story about how long it took me to record podcast episodes. Now it doesn't take me that long. That's the personal story that I hope is going to help you to remember to use content frameworks in your content marketing. You could also use client stories. You can use somebody else's story. You can tell the story of how a client achieved something. You might call this a case study or even a testimonial, but just a short little snippet of information about how someone else achieved a goal can help to cement an idea for your reader or for your listener. Another option is to tell a completely unrelated story. And I often think that this is the most powerful version. This is certainly the most fun. I have told stories about squirrels in my bird feeder. I've told stories about my neighbors not cutting their grass. I have told stories about my dad and his wisdom. None of that is related to the business content that I create, but it all makes a connection and helps people remember that key takeaway. So I could have chosen at the beginning of this episode to tell a completely unrelated story. Maybe I could have told a story. Let's call on Dad again. I could have told the story about how my dad took up woodworking when he was retired, and he used to make templates so that he didn't have to measure every piece of wood. He used to make these wooden toys, and he would make one for each of the kids or one for each of the grandkids. So he would make 6 or 7 of the same thing, and he would create templates so that he didn't have to measure every piece over and over again. And it made creating multiple things faster for him and gave him better results, more consistent results, by using templates, by using frameworks. The same way I'm asking you to use a content framework to create content more consistently and faster and easier. So that unrelated story may have actually been a better choice now that I'm thinking about it, but that's all right. We're going to go with the one that I told you. But you can see how that story can help your reader or your listener to better internalize the key takeaway or the lesson or the inspiration or the how-to information that you are giving them with your content. Then the last thing that every piece of content needs is a call to action, or as I like to put it, what are you hiring this piece of content to do? What is its job? Its job might be to make a sale, or maybe its job is to build your email list, or maybe its job is to get people to watch some other video or read some other piece of content, or maybe its job is to book a call if you're a coach. But every piece of content has a job to do. So understanding what that job is makes it easier for you to figure out what the key takeaway is and what the story is that goes along with it. And then you just put that call to action at the end. Then once you have those 3 pieces in place, all you have to do is add a short intro, maybe a sentence or 2, and a short outro. Again, nothing more than a sentence or 2, and you are done. That's it. So that's a very simple content framework that you can use to create podcast episodes, or to write emails, or to create videos, or even to publish social media updates or host a Facebook Live. I mentioned that it used to take me 2 or 3 days to record this podcast episode. And as you can imagine, it didn't leave me much room to do anything else by the time I spent half a week on a single episode. Part of that problem was perfectionism, and I've talked before about that, and I will link that video up here for you if you struggle with perfectionism. But a bigger part of the problem for me was that I was starting from scratch for every single episode. I was opening up a blank page and staring at it and thinking, what am I going to do? What am I going to talk about? What am I going to What am I going to write about? How am I going to present what I'm writing or what I'm talking about in a way that makes sense to people? I had to reinvent the wheel every single week, and that just makes things so much harder to do. It was not effective. It was not efficient. And if you know me, then you know how much I love to be efficient and effective in everything I do. I love systems. So this led me to creating these content frameworks that I use for every piece of content that I create now. So if you want to be more consistent, more effective, more efficient with your content creation, whether you're blogging or writing a Substack or podcasting or whatever it is you do for content, then here's how you can start creating your own content frameworks. First, make a simple template using whatever tool that you use to write, whether you write with Microsoft Word or Google Docs or some other writing app. Doesn't matter what it is, make a simple template, and at the top, write 3 questions so that you can think about any idea you have using this framework. The first question is, what is the key takeaway that you want people to have after they have consumed this piece of content? What is it you want them to walk away with? That's your key takeaway. That can be, like I said, it can be a lesson, it can be some inspiration, it can be some how-to information about how to do something tactical. Then the next question is, what's the story that makes this memorable? Connect it to something tangible for people so that they can remember this takeaway easier. That's going to make your content not only more memorable, but it's going to make it stand out in a sea of similar content. And then finally, what's the call to action? What do you want people to do after they have read or listened or watched your content? What's the call to action? Do you want them to make a purchase? Do you want them to book a call? Do you want them to read or watch something else? That's your call to action. That's the last thing you want in your content template. Then you can lay out your template so that all you have to do is fill in the blanks. So you might have, for an email, for example, you might include your usual greeting. My email template has, hey, first name, because that's how I start all of my emails. Then I have a section where I mention or where I have a note to myself that says the story goes here, and then the key takeaway comes next, and then the call to action. And then at the bottom of the email, I have my traditional signature, which is to your business success, Cindy, right? So that's what my email template looks like. Now, when I go to write an email, I can open that up. I can answer those questions, make sure I have that information at hand, and then write the email from there. And it's very, very quick to do because I already have all of the information that I need. Okay, now I want to hear from you. Drop me a comment below and let me know how you are using content frameworks in your content marketing efforts. Or if you're not, how you're going to start. Are you going to start publishing a podcast? Will you use them to improve your email marketing? Will you use them to write a blog post more than once in a blue moon? Leave me a comment and let me know. I'd love to hear from you. And would you also do me a favor, if you have a friend or a colleague who could use business building advice, share the link with them. It's a great way to grow the YouTube audience. I'd really appreciate your support in that way. That's it for me this week. I will be back next week with my take on the quality versus quantity debate when it comes to content marketing. And I think you might be surprised with the answer. I'll talk to you all again next week. Have a terrific day.